Hey, Matt,
Hey, Mike.
shall we do the podcast thing?
We shall.
Here we go. Welcome to, music. Oh, yeah, wasn't that a great, that piece of music that
Whoever
just
wrote
played right
that did
now?
a great job.
Yeah, good stuff. Welcome to Hacking the Grepson, the podcast where we try to act like no editing is going to happen, but it will.
Wait, you edit this?
Um, no, we just magically talk exactly the right amount. It's amazing. I'm looking forward to editing this one much more than the last few because if you have not been listening all along, I mean we're in the 60s now, and we have done a fair amount of episodes about the advent of code. And while this episode is not about the advent of code specifically, I am going to mention it one more time, despite the fact that we're now in mid-February of 2024. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the massive episodes of Wrap Up, especially with our friend Richard. That was really cool that he could join us and talk about all those. He even gave me the idea. I don't know if anybody listens to this where they're looking at the visuals of the podcast, but I actually put some images in it that hopefully synced with the problems we were talking about. I've never ever tried to do that before, so that was that was a fun thing. But no, this episode, I'd like to talk about multilingualism, which is a mouthful, and maybe there's a better way to say it. Polylingualism, duolingualism.
No sé, es un palabra muy grande.
Yes, much of the lingual. In Advent of Code, most people choose like a single programming language to do all of the problems that you're in. But you don't have to. You can do each problem in a different one. You could not even use programming. You could just write it down on a piece of paper.
I did that once.
Yeah, and sometimes that's easier. Honestly, it really depends on the puzzle and the way you think about it. But one thing I wanted to mention is that unlike the other years of Advent of Code, I went full on to the backlogs after 2023, which I have not done since. I am almost done with all the problems in 2015, which is the first year Advent of Code came out, and all the all the puzzles are up there, so you can even if you missed a previous year, you can go back and do them. I don't know. I was just really inspired, and I just wanted more, even though I still haven't finished 2023, not even close. But I was kind of curious, what 2015 was like when it first started. How has it changed? And I decided to do it in Python, which I haven't done as much of. So I've done a lot of Python lately. My brain is definitely thinking with colons and space, meaningful space. Just as a side note on Python, it's weird. I think I might be coming around to half of the Python way, which is to use a colon at the end of a statement when you're indenting a block versus using curly braces. It seems a lot more efficient and succinct and sleek, but I'm still not a convert on not having an ending symbol
Mm.
at the end of a block, because it's just I look for it. I look for it, and it's familiar and comfy to have, like, wait, where does this thing end, and not having to worry about the indentation, but just looking for either a curly brace or an end or some kind of thing like that. I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
I've always liked the spaces in Python. From the beginning, when everyone was complaining about it, I was like, no, this is great. This this makes it way easier to read. I like the colon at the end of or to like introduce a loop or a block, basically, right? I don't have a problem with the no end statement. In fact, the languages I can think of that do have not necessarily the curly brace ones, but the one where you have to like write end or something at the end, like bash, where you do fi to end the if statement, which has always annoyed me. I don't like those. I don't know why. The curly braces doesn't bother me because that's I don't know. Like they're like parentheses in my mind, so for whatever reason they have to match, but words don't have to.
Is that because you did a lot of Lisp and you're really used to open close parentheses?
It might be.
Yeah.
I hadn't ever thought about that, but yeah, maybe. But like parentheses, it's wrong to not match them. Whereas if I say if, I don't have to say fee at the end or end at the end uh, to get my point across.
Yeah, it really. I mean, I think it just depends on what you're used to. Like, it's kind of arbitrary how you indent and signify the beginning and ending of a block. I remember when I went from PHP primarily to Ruby, and Ruby is a lot. I don't know if terse is the right word. Like the syntax is a lot more terse. There's just less of it, and it felt freeing to not have to have all of the extra stuff. It's like it almost felt like magic. Like the compiler just gets it. I don't have to be as overwrought with all the stuff. I mean, even in JavaScript, I don't use semicolons anymore. Like that feels too much.
Hmm.
But I know there's people go back and forth on that. I
I
don't know.
I match the style of the repository I'm working in, which
Mm.
currently I'll have semicolons in them.
Hmm.
But I think that that comment about terseness really is important about programming languages, at least to me. Like when I go to write an if statement, and especially when I'm trying to match style and whatnot, and like, okay, these people do if space parenthesis space
Hmm.
statement space end parenthesis space open bracket and then a bunch of stuff and then another bracket. And if I want to write a one line if statement, that makes me mad every time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think my style has it's just it definitely it's evolved over time. I used to always use semicolons in JavaScript. I used to sometimes use more space. Like sometimes people put space between the open parenthesis and the next character,
Yeah, I don't
and
do
then a
that.
space, and then yeah, I see that a lot, especially online, and that's always bugged me. But I do like the space after the if and before the parenthesis. I mean, it's it's irrational. It really, I should pick a side, but I don't know. Sometimes one feels good and the other one doesn't. I
I
don't
don't
know
know.
why.
I think of the if statement as a function in my head. I know it's not, but like I think about it that way. And so to me, like I want to put that parenthesis there as if it was a function. Or I want to not
Mm,
have to have that parenthesis. If I have to have the parenthesis, I'm passing in a list of parameters or something. Basically, is the way my brain works. And if I don't have to have the parentheses, then it's fine. So Python, I write if x equals 1 colon, right? There's no parentheses
yeah.
needed in that statement. I can put them in if I want. I like that. But I like Python. So,
Yeah, no, that's a valid point. So I'm looking at my Advent of Code project, which is a Ruby on Rails website that has subdirectories for each of the years that I've worked on, and then subdirectories for each of the puzzles of that year. And in 2015, I have Python. In 2019, I think I have JavaScript or Node more specifically because I wanted to teach myself Node. Like I've used Node lots inside of things, like as part of larger projects, but I've never just done Node like just Node name a file kind of a thing. So I wanted to kind of get more familiar with that. In 2020, I so in 2019 and 2020, I have only done the first few. But 2019 was JavaScript, Node. 2020 is Lua, which I first used when I started doing Pico 8, like retro console programming, because it uses Lua for its main thing. Although I remember first hearing about it back in the World of Warcraft days, because that's
mm,
when all the mods and add-ons were made in Lua. But I didn't do that at that time, so I didn't really know it. In 2021, I did Ruby, and in 2023, and then in 2022 with you, I did TypeScript. So I have 5 different years, 5 different programming languages, and I've been kind of jumping back and forth between them because I've been trying to make them all consistent with the way that we did 2023,
mm.
which was having like the generate script, the template, and yeah. So like if I wanted to make a new day, I could just run generate day 5 and it would make the folder and all the files. And so that required me to kind of context switch between all these different languages and be like, okay, what is like the simplest canonical script template for this language? Like, how does it just run a script, and how would I make it so there's a solution one and a solution two, and those solutions take in a file that gets read and that maybe gets like turned into an array of like strings, if it's like a list of things like inputs it's going to take, and they all do it differently. They all do it differently. You can't just take one and plop it in the other. You have to transcode, transpile, translate, whatever you want to say. So that's kind of where this idea for this episode came from. Is just like, okay, there's so many different ways you can do the same thing. That you can read a file in, that you can change it into some kind of data structure, that you can then read that data structure. I wanted to make a script that I could run from one root and run the year and the days puzzle from any of those subdirectories in any of those languages. And so I had to make like a bash script that knew how to, start each of them. So they all had to have like a shebang at the front. They all had to have the execute permissions. It was like a whole, they're all doing the same thing, but I got to think about, how do I write the one universal script that can just run any of these no matter what I use? And that's kind of where all this came from. I don't know, what's your experience like? Do you have experience doing anything like this where you have to work with various languages all at once?
Yeah, not quite to that extent, but I've certainly had to work with um, having like a central library that then was loaded in by multiple different languages, even if they were
Mm-hmm.
similar. So, like, I got a C++ library, and I'm going to pull that into Objective C over here, but I'm pulling it in to C to a C++ project proper over there. And so, like, there's some amount of having to think about that, but those operate pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm.
Where it would get interesting is if yeah, you were going into more and more divergent languages. When I was in college, I tried to learn as many languages as I could, at least just to try them out. Just to Because each language kind of makes your brain think a little bit differently, unless they're super
Mm-hmm.
similar, right? Like bouncing between, I don't know, like vanilla C++, Java, and JavaScript, or TypeScript maybe, all kind of look very similar. Uh, but if you get deep in them, then they get different pretty fast, and their running environments are very different. You've got compilers versus interpreters and all that fun stuff. As for managing multiple languages, I think the way you're doing it makes sense to me. For Advent of Code, I've only tried out two languages, which are TypeScript and Python. I've done Python 2 years, and I have yet to try to make the each of those years has been very different from each other in how I was running the overall structure of my code, because I've learned
Mm-hmm.
something every year, and I'm like, okay, I want to do this, I want to do that. I still want to make it so generic that I have kind of like a wrapper around the whole
Mm-hmm.
thing that kind of runs it, that can maybe do visualization based on in and out uh, parameters, as opposed to trying to embed it into my code, because I want to take the language out, because in a perfect world
Yeah.
we are writing software, we are not writing a particular language, right? The language is a
Yes.
tool to get to the end, and different languages are better at different things. If I want to do a bunch of asynchronous crap in the background and I don't really care about the results, I'm much more likely to use something like JavaScript or TypeScript, uh, because they're designed to not block, right? To do synchronous
Right.
operations in there where you do care about the results as you go and you need a block, it's kind of annoying to write in them. And since everything I write works like that, it's kind of annoying to write in them. Uh, Python, great for a lot of things. Probably wouldn't use it for something that was super needed to be really optimized by time, right? So it'd be
Mm-hmm.
nice if, in general, we could write a language, and it just any language, and output it to something that could run in in the basic format. I guess that's what an executable is. Uh,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also sounds like it sounds like something when I first started learning .NET,
mhm.
Microsoft .NET. You can write these programs in C or C plus or C sharp, sorry, C plus plus, C sharp, F sharp, Visual Basic, and it all compiles down to like some intermediary code that is then compiled to the executable, or however you're running it, and that's kind of like the dream. Because, yeah, if you don't have that and you have instead what I was doing, which is essentially like, okay, I need to do these basic things like file input and iterate on a list or something like that. So you can tell I've been doing Python because I called it a list and not an array.
Well, lists and arrays are different. Uh,
In Python, what's the difference between a list and an array then?
in Python, there isn't a difference, but just in general,
Oh, I see. Okay.
a lists have the ability theoretically to split them up and rejoin them, more or less. And lists don't come with, I guess, random access. Where I want this element by default, but in Python, they just did the best of both. They
Oh, I see.
they're like, here's all the cool things about lists, but also we want this stuff from arrays. So
So you're saying lists are just arrays but better?
yeah, the way they're
Okay.
implemented in Python, yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, I pretty much use them, synonymously.
But that is actually a really interesting point about multilingualism is
Hmm.
different languages treat their like first class citizen data structures differently.
Hmm.
It's still I've been doing this like 3 years now, and it still trips me up bouncing between Python and TypeScript because the way that Python natively folds in the hash map, right, the dictionary, um,
Hmm.
looks identical to the way that TypeScript does objects, but they do
Hmm.
not function at all the same, and it really
Hmm.
annoys me.
Programming languages are created by humans, and they're not perfect, and they learn over time, and unfortunately, you may start a programming language with certain syntax and rules, and then over time it gains stuff from other languages that it learns, much like human languages. I mean, that was another major point of this episode, was that like trying to do the same basic things in all of these languages is a lot like learning human languages, which I also do for fun in Duolingo. I mean, I'll start on a language and just start learning kind of the basics of like, the pronouns and the basic vocabulary and basic syntax of how to, say, hey, how are you? My name is, your dog stole my potato chips in Germany, that kind of stuff. Um,
Why was my dog in
and
Germany?
you'll have to talk to your dog about that. I don't know.
Watch
Um, he heard about schnitzel, and I don't know. Um, he yeah, so trying to write like a template for like a canonical Python script versus a JavaScript script or a Lua script or a Ruby script is very similar. It's just like, how do you say hello world in these things, or how do you, yeah. And so it's fun for me in the same way, because it's much harder to go deeper on these languages, like to learn like the really deep stuff, especially when it comes to like optimization or threading, or the things that like actual companies want you to be able to do in the trenches. I'm more interested, because it's easier to kind of do the simple stuff, but in a lot of different languages, because I find that fun.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's why I eventually this year finally was like, okay, I'm gonna start working on the advent of code repo. Yeah, I'm not thinking about it as in like, okay, oh, it's advent of code, it's 2023. Okay, create a new 2023 directory and just start writing scripts. No, now I'm ready for 2024 in whatever language, because I have like this foundational knowledge, and I have some libraries. I have libraries in Python, JavaScript, Lua, Ruby, and TypeScript that do things like pull in a file or do a 2D array graph, or grid, that kind of stuff, because I know now that that's important. And it's interesting to me, like I said, to learn how these different languages do them differently. You mentioned, we're talking about Python, lists versus arrays, or dictionaries versus hashes or objects or something like that. One thing about Lua that is, I mean, I assume by design, but it's brain breaking. Like, they don't have the concept of an array, really. They do, but they call them tables, and they don't work
Mm.
generally like arrays do in most other programming languages that I do. So it's like to do something in Lua that seems second nature in these other languages takes a bit more. Like I actually had to find a essentially a plugin for Lua that someone else had written that treats tables like arrays so that you can use array functions like your normal like you're used to, except using the table data structure that Lua uses. And I'm like, really? I have to add a plugin just so I can, you know, slice an element out of an array or something like that. I forgot. It was very basic, and I was like, really? That's not a part of the language? Like, why would you build a language that can't handle array functions like that? So, but
Well, again, I think different languages are designed for different purposes. I think you
yeah.
and I approach learning languages differently, which is also why I can't learn human languages very well. Which is the way you described that of like, okay, I'm learning the pronouns and this vocabulary. I want to learn things that way, and I have learned that I do not learn things that way. They don't stick. I
Yeah.
have to jump in and use the thing and really understand like where it comes from. So I do better with
Mm,
languages if I understand like how they evolved to be what they are, and that's both true in human and artificial languages. So, for example,
interesting.
when you were talking about trying to make everything function similarly, I'm like, well, but is that the right approach? Right? Because Ruby is object oriented at its core. So,
Yeah.
really, anything you're doing in Ruby, you should be doing if you want to do it the Ruby way. By like munchy by monkey patching
Oh.
classes, and having all the various different classes for everything.
Hmm.
And Python has its whole like Pythonic way of doing things, and so if you do it one way, it's wrong. If you do it this other way, it's right. Going into something like TypeScript or JavaScript, those are designed much more around like um, map, reduce, filter, and things like that than Python is more these days, but it wasn't. I don't feel like as much before. Whereas I don't necessarily ever think about doing that in Ruby. Then again, it's been 15 years since I wrote anything in Ruby. Uh, um, so like I like to really get at the why. Why is this programming language designed this way? Um,
Hmm.
what's it for? And how do I use it best for that? So, for example, like JavaScript, the why behind why it is the way it is because it was written real fast.
Hmm.
Is like a big portion of it. Some of it's also we wanted to be non-blocking, et cetera, et cetera. But a big portion of it is just they wrote it fast, and
Yeah.
now we have to maintain backwards compatibility forever.
Hmm.
Is a huge part of why it functions the way it does. Python approaches things from a different perspective of like we're going to do one thing. We have one way to do something. This is the correct way to do it. Yeah, yeah, sure. There's some other ways that maybe you could probably achieve the same result, but the correct way to do it is it's opinionated, right?
Hmm.
Ruby, everything's an object, right? Lisp is its own
Everything's a
world, right? Really,
parenthesis.
really, if you're writing Lisp, you really should be writing like domain specific languages in Lisp and then using those to like right. Uh, Lisp is all about like writing meta languages
Hmm.
to solve your problem. And like all of those are different ways of approaching things. And uh much like you said, much harder to get to that kind of like core deep understanding of the language. But you have to start somewhere. And so I think what you're doing is a fantastic way to do that because you're getting your hands dirty with the language.
Hmm.
And you'll realize as you go through, you're like, I'm really struggling with arrays in Lua, for example, right? Maybe
Hmm.
arrays aren't the right solution to this problem in Lua, and I need to have the same like general framework, but then by the time it hits, instead of dropping it into an array, I'm going to drop it into this other structure, a table, whatever. And then I have to think about it differently from then down. Um,
Yeah.
Having not ever done anything Lua, I don't have, I can't be any more specific than that.
I no, I love that perspective. I think I've always been very much I don't want to say a Renaissance man, but like I definitely enjoy the breadth of knowledge approach. over the depth of knowledge, and I don't know exactly where that comes from. I don't know, like, if I've ever made a realization about when I first started doing that. But I mean, maybe it's like I'm not trying to self-diagnose myself on the podcast, but maybe it's kind of an attention
I
span kind
I
of
mean, I
thing.
wasn't gonna say it, but my immediate thought was, well, that's ADHD, clearly, because I'm the same exact way.
Yeah,
I like to like dip my toes in the water on a lot of little things. I like to understand a little about a lot, and then every
yeah,
once in a while, I'll get really interested in one thing, and I will deep dive on that. Um, but like when I in college, when I was learning a bunch of languages, I like Lisp. I did a lot of because I enjoyed it. I liked the way it worked. It was very different from all the other languages I was using. But like fourth, I touched fourth like long enough to be like, okay, I hate fourth.
I have not touched that, so
Yeah.
doesn't sound like I
Fourth
should.
is a stack based language, if I remember correctly, where you don't say 3 plus 5, you say 3 5 plus, and then
Mm-hmm.
it pops off the previous two parameters that are on the stack and uses them,
Mm-hmm.
which is cool and it was like a really interesting view into programming in a different approach. And I'm like, okay, I
Yeah.
see where this came from. It's used a lot in like old calculators, would do things like that
Oh,
because it
yeah.
makes sense.
It feels very context specific
Yeah,
language.
but it's hard to wrap your head around it. Jumping from something like fourth to even something like Ruby, which maybe they look vaguely similar, but they function completely differently. And
Mm-hmm.
that also goes into programming paradigms, right? If you got
Yeah.
functional programming versus procedure versus object oriented versus whatever they're doing this week. I'm sure there's a new thing that has something to do with AI. Uh,
Yeah,
um, yeah,
prompt programming.
yeah, it's all different. But it teaches you a lot of it makes your brain expand and think about solving problems in a different way, I think.
Yeah, and much like with human languages, yeah, just doing the breadth approach, you find that there's so many different ways to approach the same basic parts of a language. Like just for instance, I'm looking at JavaScript and TypeScript are very similar uh, in terms of the. I mean, they are the same syntax. It's just JavaScript doesn't have the type.
Yeah.
That's where the type in TypeScript comes from. So it's all
Yeah.
loosely typed. But
TypeScript,
comparing
it's a
that,
superset of JavaScript.
right? But like comparing something as simple as commenting, like in JavaScript and TypeScript, you do like the double forward slash, or you can do the slash star to start a block. But in Ruby and Python, they use
It's a
the
hash.
hash.
Yep.
And then in Lua, they use the triple dash.
Oh, I
Why?
don't
I
like
don't
that at
know.
all.
No, I don't like it either. Well, it takes up two extra characters on a line, which I
That's why I don't like it.
not not a fan of. Yep, so you can write that off. But then other things, another thing that I like when I'm doing like terminal or command line programming, where all the output is just on the command line, is colors, and they all do colors somewhat differently. I mean, there's a different plugin for each of them that I had to find, and the way that you use that plugin to essentially mark up your string is different. The way that you create functions in Lua, it's all local function, name of function, parentheses. In Ruby, it's def function, parentheses. In JavaScript, it's just function. They get rid of the def.
Or sometimes
Uh,
not even that.
right. You could have anonymous functions that don't even have names. Uh, and then Python also does the def. So Ruby and Python very similar, except they have the colon at the end. Um, when you're doing classes in Python, one thing that I don't really understand why it's this way, but I just do it, is that you have to supply the self or some variable meaning the self, whereas I don't do that in any other programming language. It seems unnecessary because this exists, or I don't know,
Right.
but that's
So
just something
that's
that
where diving into the why comes in handy because you're like,
yeah,
oh, it's a
why is
message
that?
passing system. So
Uh-huh.
it's the first thing is the person I'm passing it to, right? But could that have been hidden from us?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, it could
Um,
have.
Also, I prefer self to this as a identifier for my currently operated upon object in
Hmm.
object-oriented programming, but it's really Python. Everywhere else is
Right.
more or less this.
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean, it could
and
be any word,
I
really.
prefer the hashes to the double slash for
Yeah.
comments.
I,
And I
I,
don't know why.
I
I just do.
yeah, yeah, I like the hash. The hash is fine.
And then there's the environments that you have to run all these things in. That's very different, right? If I want to run JavaScript, I
Hmm.
can just run node name of package. But when I run TypeScript, I
Hmm.
probably have to compile that using TSC
Yep.
first. Um, Python, I can run it directly. Ruby, you can run it directly. C++, nope, you got to compile that, right? And then the infrastructure is about like how you set up dependencies and how you install those dependencies is different per language. So doing something like what you're doing for Advent of Code is not a small task because there's so many little idiosyncratic nuances that you have to deal with as you go, which I'm sure you are dealing with as you go through this.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We don't even need to get into the import versus require thing, and then Ruby has like require and require relative, depending
Yeah.
on where the package is. Sometimes you do like in Node, you can do import or you can do like variable like var or const some name equals require a package, or you can do const and then you open curly braces and just the specific functions that you want to
Yep.
pull in. Yeah, there's a lot of weeds that you can get into, but it's just interesting to me how they're all doing the same thing. They're all doing like, okay, I need a plugin or a module, pull it in from somewhere. Okay, how do I do it in this language? Well, it's not the same. Okay, I want to create a function, I want to create a variable, I want to create a comment, these are the hello worlds of the language, and they all do it a little differently. And when I'm working in one for a while and then I switch to another one, I invariably write it the old way. And but I think the takeaway from all this, I think, is that it is good to do this. It is important to understand because, like you said, much like human languages, the way you express things and the vocabulary and the syntax that you have at your disposal does color how you can communicate and how you think about the world. And using different programming languages that do it different ways does make you think differently. I mean, it's all zeros and ones at the end, but how you get there, the journey is definitely important because it does make you think about these things differently and the way you approach solving problems. And like you said, the context that it's in, like why was this programming language created? Maybe it's useful in one context and not as useful in another context. And this exercise of just trying to create kind of like a universal, run this year's and this day's puzzle. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And it's interesting, and I think it's a useful exercise. So
I
that's
agree.
why I
And
that's why I liked it.
it's kind of like if we abuse the analogy of human languages a little bit more, uh,
Oh, let's.
when I travel, I like to experience the local culture
Hmm.
specifically. I don't care about museums or anything else. I want to see real people interacting in real life
Hmm.
because I want to see how people function. Um, so, programming languages can be like that. You go on vacation and try out a language for a while and see if, hey, you know what? Maybe I can move here.
I couldn't have put it better myself. Actually, so once I finish with 2015, I think I may move on to 2016, and I think I'm going to try Golang,
Oh,
which I've never done before, beyond a few like toy tutorials or something. The one thing about it that I think you have to compile it. I think it's compiled into an executable or some kind of runtime thing, which I don't like because for Advent of Code, it's much easier if it just you just interpret it. But it is a popular thing, and uh, it seems like it's not necessarily going away. It's not a dying language, so I figured it'd be a good next one to try. I don't know, and different paradigm, different syntax, all that kind of stuff. So I
yeah.
don't know. Do,
And
do you
it's
have any languages that you've been always meaning to try?
Lua is actually high on my list. There's some other things, Haskell, Erlang, that I would like to try because again, they approach the problems from different directions.
Mhm.
Um, but because of that, there's also a heavier lift to getting started with them, and I haven't had the brain power or bandwidth to do that.
It's a I mean, Advent of Code is both a great way to get you to try it, but it's also, like you said when we started 2023, it's a huge mental burden to not only have to solve a problem, but also figure out the idiosyncrasies of a language, especially if you're not using it in any other context.
Yeah.
Uh, so I understand that. Yeah, and that's why it's perfect to try something like Golang on an old year when it's not active and I can just kind of putter away at it, which is what I've done with Python in 2015. I've just puttered over the last couple months here and there. One last thing about 2015, since I've almost got all of them and I've only had to use like some some solutions from the Reddit subreddit a few times. I've mainly got it all on my own, which I think says a lot about the difficulty of 2023. 2015 is easier than 2023 and 2022 and 2021. It's gotten harder, and I think it's because there's just only so many problems and puzzles you can make. And, I've seen a lot of similar ones, and just the input that he gives you and the things that part two comes up with. 2015, not as nearly as many surprises. So, I mean, I think this is empirical evidence that it has gotten harder, and I don't feel as bad about 2023 being unfinished. But yeah, if you want to go back and feel better about yourself, 2015 is a good place to start.
Well, now I want to do that.
Yeah, I want you to, because there's definitely some fun ones in there. Without spoiling too much, there's two problems near the end about essentially simulating a role-playing battle system.
Cool.
So get in on that. I think that wraps it up for this episode. This actually went a lot longer than I was expecting, but that's just how it is. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Hacking the Grepson about multilingualism. If you want to listen to more episodes, we're at hackingthegrepson.com. We try to put out an episode once every other week on Wednesday. And I swear, except in passing, this is the last time that Advent of Code until December is going to be a topic. We're going to move on to other topics next time. But until then, we now return you to your regularly scheduled lives already in progress.